Hello all together. My name is Christoph Müller. I'm a musician, a caricaturist. I'm very happy to have the honor and pleasure to speak today to Jason J. Smart. He is a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post. Welcome to the channel, Jason.
It's nice to see you, Christoph.
Let's start with a very urgent question. In the moment, the Russians are really testing the NATO. The threat of Russia on NATO and especially on Europe is extremely rising now. What is your assessment?
Clearly, there's an increased chance of conflict now. I don't think it's actually due directly, but indirectly rather, to the fact that Russia is now routinely challenging NATO's airspace. And what I mean by that is this. I think that simply the rule of probabilities. The more Russian drones or aircraft that goes over NATO airspace, the higher probability for it to have a conflict or to collide with something, even by accident, which could then cause a chain reaction of events which Moscow does not foresee. Something that could be an overreaction or a reaction that will become much larger consequences than what we might anticipate. I think, though, the reality is that Russia does not at this point want to have a war with NATO. I think it's strategically unwise. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense considering that they just had a summer offensive in Ukraine where, despite having 210,000 casualties at least, they were unable to take less than 1% of the territory. So fighting against Europe or NATO is just wholly unrealistic. So the question would be, why did they really do it then? Mm-hmm. And my answer is, so then the conclusion is actually a bit different and a lot more strategically wise. I think that Russia's objective to take Ukraine has not changed. They still wish to conquer the territory of Ukraine, but they can't currently do that. And one of the main reasons they cannot do that is that there's been a paradigm shift. Ukraine wishes to not engage in attritional warfare. It's rather taking the war to Russia by doing attacks within Russia, such as against the oil industry, destroying 20% of refineries, destroying things such as military infrastructure, destroying factories. And the objective here, once again, is to not fight an attritional war, but rather to fight a war in Russia against the Russian military there and making it possible for them to engage in war or have supply lines that function normally within occupied Ukraine. But the response to that by the Russians is exactly that. It knows that its strength right now is not its infantry. It's not having successes. But, it does have a normal missile system. It does have a normal drone system. But Ukraine has very good air defense. So if Russia really wants to see a paradigm shift, they should make sure that Ukraine doesn't have air defense. So how can they do that? Obviously, they can't warn the West anymore. The West doesn't care. They'll give air defense whenever they want to. But the way you can stop is to make the Europeans not want to send air defense. And the way you do that is called reflexive control in Soviet theory, which is, what do I have to do to trigger in you the response that is best in my interest? Not in your interest, but in my interest. But you're doing it with the thought that you are helping yourself. In this case, it would be something like flying some drones over EU or NATO countries. The response being then that those EU NATO countries send no more send no more air defense to Ukraine, which then makes the invasion and overtaking Ukraine much easier for the Russians. But that's the end all objective, I think. It's how do they cause the Europeans to stop supporting Ukraine or assisting Ukraine? And that would seem like a very easy way to do it. But to actually start a war with Europe, it would what would be the objective of that? I mean, if they can't take villages in eastern Ukraine that are unoccupied, I can't imagine taking European cities is going to be much easier. I think that it's much more simple. They're just causing the West to reallocate scarce resources in a way that behooves the Kremlin.
To me, the situation looks like that, as you said, they cannot advance in Ukraine. It's really easy for them to disturb and to turmoil our societies here in Europe, in Germany especially. Also, but it was like also Spain and in France. They are really active everywhere, and the rest of Europeans, we are not aware of the danger which is coming from Russia, and Ukraine is. We always try to push them away, and so I think the Russians cannot advance really in Ukraine, and so they start to act more here in Europe. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that the Russians understand that they have no physical capacity to wage war against Europe, but it's sort of like the Black Sea Fleet. If you remember the foreign policy of Russia going back in the 2000s and before the invasion of Crimea and all this, it's very similar, is that Russia sometimes would do escalatory things. For instance, it would, with its Black Sea Fleet, but more often it was actually with its aircraft going around Alaska or, coming very close to American fighter jets. But what was the real objective of that? Like, what do they gain from that? And my argument's always been it's actually not about the United States. It wasn't a threat to NATO. They're doing that to look like they are willing to provoke NATO, that they're not scared of it, because then other countries that are much smaller or not members of NATO, such as Georgia or Ukraine, see this as intimidation because they say if they're willing to fight with Russia, Russia's willing to fight the rest of NATO, obviously it's willing to fight with us. Obviously, it's shown itself to be totally prepared for that because no other country, Georgia, would never try to challenge the U.S. that way very openly. The Ukrainians never would have, for instance, even if they were against the United States, they would never have done that just because it's irrational. It's totally crazy. But Russia's trying to show that they have the capacity to do so. But who's the audience? Whom do they want to actually see this? So I guess for their own population, there's a positive. So it looks like they're serious. They have a very serious military. But the real reason is not the United States, because the U.S. could destroy their aircraft if it wished to. It's so that the other countries in the region think that Russia is a serious threat, that Russia is a country that can seriously extract vengeance. Because if you're willing to go against NATO, all the countries of it, then obviously you're willing to go against any given singular country, be it Armenia, Azerbaijan, whoever it is. That's the real objective the Russians have.
The Russians, they are militarily not a little tiny fraction that strong as they always show to be, but they are really, really good in making disinformation and spreading the false narratives around the world. And I speak as a German, here in Germany, they are really open to that. The information war is it's a much bigger threat than the military war. For the Russians, if they are able to change the government, like they have also, I say they have done it also in America. They changed the government. It's Donald Trump is a pro-Russian guy. But also here in Germany, we have pro-Russian parties are really rising here. And in England today, Nigel Farage has pretty good chances to become the next prime minister. And so if they can topple all those governments here in Europe, then they don't have to fight war against that.
What you're alluding to is, yes, this hybrid warfare. But I think it's a little bit different. I don't disagree with you, but I think it's a little bit different, is that we should understand it in this context, perhaps. Maybe this would be illuminating to the conversation, is that in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, the war has already had World War I and World War II and World War III. So the Second World War didn't work out well for Russia. They lost 26 million civilians and everything else. It was just a huge loss of life. But there's another aspect of this as well, which is that for Vladimir Putin, I think there's a very reasonable thing in his mind that he thinks he's winning. Because he thinks that overall, he is showing that the West, if it's pressed long enough, isn't very unified. The West does start to break apart. And that's something that I think satisfies him greatly. I think that when he meets with him in China, she undoubtedly thinks that Putin has made a huge mistake in Ukraine. At the same time, he must be sort of pleased to see that, it's having an effect. It's causing chaos with the European countries and the relationship with the United States. All these things are serving Putin's end-all goal. But Putin as a whole, I think, is aiming ahead to not have a real conflict. Once again, it's all psychological. So it's psychological. That makes a lot more sense why they use drones to fly over Estonia or airplanes over, one of the Baltic states. Because the Russians are seeking a psychological effect, which will get the West to not fight against it. That is the goal. I mean, why do you get the Americans involved in countries in Latin America, or if it's in Eastern Europe or Africa? Well, the reason they got them involved in the Cold War was so they would not be engaged with the Soviet Union directly. They used the proxies. And I think it's very similar today. I think the strategy fundamentally has not changed in any real way.
Okay, wow. Jason, another topic in my head is always the last information which are spreading around is always those really fantastic attacks what the Ukrainians perform on the Russian oil industry. Also, you made podcasts about that. And the Russian economy is really going down, and the lines of cars in front of the gas stations are getting longer and longer. And so for Putin, the situation domestically is really getting bad. And as we know, always when the situation for Putin is getting bad, he puts another escalation. He will escalate more. So now he is in the middle of the Ukraine war against Ukraine, but there is no progress. So to me, the signs are really clear that the next escalation step would really be a hard attack on some NATO country, European country. What is your opinion on that?
I mean, historically, Russia doesn't do that. What they typically do is attacks that then they say were not related to themselves. I mean, just look at these recent attacks, the drone strikes. They said it was not them. Same with the airplanes. They said it was protecting their Baltic Sea related assets. It usually lies about it. So to do something that would obviously capture it, that would be able to easily prove is Russia, is not typically what they do. In 2014, when they invaded Crimea, they sent the little green men to Donbass. It was the same thing. They said it was Ukrainians fighting against their own country. It was a civil war. Russia typically does not use its own hands. It's very non-typical of Russia. It knows that very well. The West is prepared for traditional warfare. I mean, we both build up our militaries, we understand we're against each other, and the objective is to take each other's capitals. But that's sort of passé. They realize like that's wholly unrealistic. There's not going to be Russians in Washington anytime soon. So, and they know that. So what they have to do instead is something a little bit different. How is it they can create enough chaos in the West that the West loses its interest in Ukraine or makes bad mistakes in its policy towards Ukraine, which allows it to win? Because ultimately, I think that's the real goal here. It's to win in Ukraine. Ultimately, yes, it would like to see the downfall of the West, but I don't think that's the immediate goal. The immediate goal is much more direct and straightforward and simple because, as you observed, their economy is a disaster. Their banks have significant liquidity problems. We see that it's not sustainable what they're dealing with right now. The national budget has massive holes in it. They've emptied out a number of the private banks to help fund the military. The military then receives that money, or the defense contractors receives that money and does not give it back to the banks, which means that the banks at this point really could have bank runs. I mean, when you look at these sorts of problems, they're not in a position to do much more right now than just cause some sort of a paradigm shift. Now, what would trigger that, is it could be anything. It could be economic in nature. It could be political in nature. It could be most anything. But at this point, to do something that would directly contradict their military's ability to already wage war in the country that's their priority would seem extremely unwise. I think more likely is they would probably do something like using terrorists, which then they could claim have nothing to do with them, create a humanitarian crisis or something like that. Sure, they could do something like that, but it would never be the Russian military. And look at the case of Germany, which we could talk about Germany if you'd like to specifically, is, I think that you look at the rise of the Syrian immigrants. Who is the country who's bombing Syria this whole time? It was the Russians.
Yeah, sure.
They created a humanitarian crisis, and then guess what? The Syrian immigrants and others show up to Germany and other countries. We see the rise of far-right political parties. Look at Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD in the past numbers. Look at the reason that people vote for them. We know why it is. It's not like it's a secret, and which is actually, I think, when we're trying to analyze them, and I'm sure you agree, I don't agree with the name calling of them, because we have to understand, like, what is a concern these people have? Like, what fundamentally are they worried about? It's very easy to say, they're radical. But let's think fundamentally, like, what is it that they're driven by? And if we understand that, we can say, okay, so where do we see Russia's fingerprints? And usually you'll find Russia's fingerprints that somehow, well, look, they're really scared of immigrants. Fine. And guess what? Which country is doing more to boost immigrants into Europe than any other country in the world today? And there's only one country that's involved. It's Russia. Remember in the Belarusian border before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the immigrants they had from the Middle East, also from Syria, with bicycles and things like this on the Lithuanian as well as on the Polish border. This is something that Russia does routinely. Immigration crises specifically. We look at the financing of radical groups, be it far left or far right. I mean, in the case of Germany, I've always been very suspect of the ties to environmental groups and Russian interest. And it's obviously doing something bad. I mean, I'm also very favorable to the environment. But Russia understands that not using nuclear power is very much so in their interest. They also understand that making sure that you have a dependency on Russian-made fossil fuels is something that is directly in Russia's interest. And that's a leading country in Europe. If you could convince it, you've won the whole game for Europe. And so this is, I think, a very clear strategy. And once again, I've never deeply investigated that, but I have no doubt whatsoever in my heart, because I know how they've worked with environmental groups in the United States, and they promote the narratives of whether it's pipelines or exporting LNG. This would be extremely detrimental to Russia. And I'm not going to say that the environmental arguments are totally false or anything like this, but simply, why do they get so much attention considering the rest of the population? Well, Russia has a stated interest in doing that. I think if you look at the case of Germany, when they look at the huge population you have from the former Soviet states that immigrated in the 1990s to Germany, right? Look at the voting tendencies they have. Look at the people that live in Northeast Germany specifically, and look at the narratives that are most common. Look at Google searches in Germany by region and see what a difference it is. And you know what? You can see a lot of things that would align very strongly with Russian narratives in what is now Northeast Germany. Why is that? Where is that coming from? And I think we all know where that is.
Yeah, that is the Russians are really good also in the use of the social media, which chopped away the so-called mainstream media, the public media. They're doing a fantastic job in Germany, but by those circles they are completely denied, and they say we will never watch this again because they all lie. I could never believe how it is possible that the people prefer to believe lies instead of seeing the truth. So how can we how can we fight this overwhelming power of lies and false narratives which is coming now? We have to flood the zone. Let me just say this sentence: flood the zone with shit, which is made by Steve Bannon, the former strategist of Donald Trump. We have to put again, flood the zone with facts. But how can we do that? We don't have the means.
So it's I can explain is that because trust me, I've thought a lot about this for many years.
Yeah,
not just recently. Where it gets complicated is okay. Let's start with the premise. So Russia has this famous theory. I mean, I think it's art theory. We call it to name what they do. They probably use a different word, but we call it the fire hose of lies or propaganda. So what it is, you just put out so much information and facts at the same time that it just leaves everybody confused as to what's really going on. So if in the case of, let's say, choose any political issue it is. If, okay, perfect. Current situation in the United States. There's the assassination of somebody on the right, Charlie Kirk, just a week ago. Now, what's interesting is to see immediately what narratives start to appear in the news, and it's undoubtedly Russia. But it starts out with something like, and I'm just making examples from the top of my head, or ones I've heard about recently, is they'll say something, for instance, that he was killed by somebody who's a Trump supporter, but the next guy said he's killed by somebody who's a far left. The next one he said he's a gay rights organizer. The other one said he was homophobic. The other one said that he was, very partial to Russia. The other one said he had no interest and is actually a radical pro-Ukraine supporter. But anyways, all these things are totally contradictory statements. They cannot be both at the same time true.
Yeah.
And so as a binary decision, you have to decide, is it this or that? Now, most people probably fall back on their own biases and choose to believe whichever one of the two stories they read because they're their bias set. But that adds, once again, that's confirmation bias, which is a fallacy. You're only believing this information because it confirms what you already wanted to believe. But at the same time, as a society, what does it do? Why would Russia do that? Well, it's because it's sort of wrong to think that it's a left or right issue. Their ideas, inherently, it's sort of a Hegelian dialectic is the way that they typically look at it. Hegel would have said that, there's this conflict in society that rises to a new point, that leads to a new one. And at some point, there's a breakdown. And once it breaks down, you have to understand what the new thing is. So in the case of, let's imagine, I want to take a little control of Russia, what the Russians did to their own country. How do I do this? How do I make the police take over in a way that's justifiable? Well, let's commit some terrorism. So you commit some domestic terrorism, the police themselves. As a response, the people say, please come protect us, save us. And then you could justify to send all the police in that then are able to occupy the cities and control what happens. I think it's the same thing here with what we see and what happens in liberal societies in the West, or in Germany definitely, is that they are able to use these different factors, these different elements of society. So you could be very pro-environment. You could be extremely alternative for Deutschland. You could be very, an immigrant from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, but is ethnic German who, his family was sent there 120 years ago. But they're working with each one of these different components as like different sections of the symphony. They each have their own role to play. And hopefully the roles push against each other. That is, if I'm an alternative for Deutschland, I really think that I'm helping Germany. I don't think he's probably assumes he's doing something bad. In his mind, he probably thinks he's doing something useful. But that puts him in conflict with the immigrant. And the immigrant then views him negatively. And that pushes them back to their own communities, which is going to create more conflict with this AfD sort of people. With the environmentalists, just put the environment first ahead of the interest of Germany. And then they are conflicting. But in Russia's eyes, this is perfect. This is exactly what they want. Everybody is serving their own interest, truly thinking they're doing the right thing. Nobody thinks they're doing something bad. They think they're doing something good. And Russia is able to capitalize on that efficiently. And that's why I think it's so hard. So we have that background. And I apologize, this is an extremely long answer. I didn't mean to go so long. But I've been traveling and my mind is all over the place. But the other thing is how do you deal with this now? Well, okay, if we understand that's the case. So they're working with all these different populations. They're spreading, thousands of different messages a day. I mean, tens of thousands of Facebook or Twitter or TikTok accounts. But aside from all that, just step aside from this, just inherently, you are a democratic civil society. You can see this, see it's a problem, but you go to the government. And the government says, so should we be the ones you want us to go on and tell people their political views are financed by Russia and that we're going to pull it off the internet? That we really support the nuclear power and that's a wrong view to have, so it should be, eliminated? No, of course not. But in the same way, if you have something like the immigrants issue, the government has to be very careful to what it says that is free speech in their own population, in favor or against immigrants. What is free speech? But if you know that free speech is actually getting legs or being promoted further once it's said, or even before it's said, by Russia, how do you control it without looking like it's persecution? And that's actually where the Russian Orthodox Church is so successful as being an agent of the Russian state. Nobody wants to close down a church. Good luck. Who wants to go arrest the priest and the monks there? It'd be a disaster. For public affairs, a total disaster. And so Russia knows, and if that were to happen, Russia wouldn't cry about it. They would love this because then they say, look, there's a persecution of religion in Europe and it's against us. Russia has played this, I say, strategized this game very well. They know exactly where all these different chess pieces play.
That sounds not so positive and optimistic. What you say now. It's when we zoom out, it's like the Russians. They are very good in causing chaos. They are really good in destroying things. They are fantastic in spreading lies and so on. So they are really good in destroying things. But in the end, everything is destroyed. How can we? So they will also lose. Everybody will lose. This is for sure. That's the truth. And but again, how can we make the people think that this has to be stopped? Everybody's trying it, but on a very small scale, and we cannot conquer the whole destruction. Instead of except the Ukrainians, they fight against it. They are able to destroy the Russians.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the Ukrainians are the only ones taking this fight seriously for very clear reasons, and they're doing a great job. I mean, considering what a small country is compared to Russia, it's phenomenal what they've achieved.
Yeah.
And of course, it comes at a huge sacrifice, but it's also, let's be honest, is the role of Western weapons. It's why Russia doesn't want to engage in actual warfare. It's a disaster when you're against modern weapons. And that's why, it was so clear that this has been a total failure. They did not anticipate a long war. They anticipated truly, about a week to replace the government, put in someone who's pro-Moscow, and they leave. They did not foresee this. Mm-hmm. So, anyways, going ahead though, what does it all mean? So, I think that if you're a country like Germany, it does get really complicated very fast because if you're a political leader, you cannot readily manipulate what is happening domestically in the country without being infringing on their rights, going against people, or being perceived as going against people, even if it's false. Because that's the reality of how democracies function. And Russia understands that. Russia understands that it can use proxies to voice things that it would like to have in the population. And I've said this before publicly, is, I have not looked into, I cannot prove, but I can look back historically and say that routinely Russia supported things in countries like the United States with not just the Communist Party in the Soviet period, obviously they did, and not just the trade unions, obviously they did, but they also worked with things such as choose it, racist organizations or like Ku Klux Klan, or if it's something like the civil rights movement. They were also supportive of that. None of this was for ideological purposes, though. This is not because they care about the humanity. It's the same reason they were painting in New York back in the 60s, and again, today in Europe, they do the same thing, but it's in biographies of KGB agents in the 50s and 60s that they paint swastikas in New York or in the Harlem, which is the black area, or in different parts of Europe. Why is this? To create back this memories of the war and how the Europeans fight with each other. To create distrust amongst the Europeans, to create a conflict in Europe because then nobody's paying attention to the hammer and sickle. Mm-hmm. That was the objective. And the same thing is continuing today. I think a lot of the fights that we see, I mean, you wonder, where do some people extremely, strange, extremely far right or extremely far left or extremely, pro anything that is not what the general public feels. How do they rise to become so popular? We saw that Russia recently was financing people on the far right, specifically YouTube channels that I felt were going to promote things, and they never told them what to say, which they don't have to. They just have to say, listen, this anti-immigration rhetoric is really beautiful. Let's encourage that. Or this guy is saying really good things about don't trust the Democrats, and the courts are all fake. Don't trust the courts. If people don't trust the courts, your ability to run a state collapses very fast. So I think that Russia is... frankly, it's very smart because we're not prepared for that. We waste how many billions of dollars a year on NATO, on specifically military stuff, military preparedness. And I'm not saying it's a total waste. I don't mean to dismiss it. Let me be clear. I don't mean in that sense. But I said, how much more could we cut from that, find money there, and say perhaps we should spend more of this on the psychological warfare that Russia's fighting? How about we look a little bit deeper into this? Because right now, Russia believes it is engaged in a war. It 100% believes there is a global war. And though it's not hot, and it allows, even Putin meets with Trump, don't be confused. For them, this is the new era of war. You don't have to be like the old era. They don't have to, act like they did before. They can act totally normal because we're not expecting it. And that's what allows them to succeed. As long as they keep saying, yes, we're interested in peace. Yes, we're working together. Everyone says, oh, look, they want a peace deal. But you don't understand. For them, it's an existential question. And allowing the West to continue is not a question. It's not possible. And actually, a common belief held, I would guess, by the senior leadership of all of Russia today, whether it's Putin or anyone else in his close circle, Patrushev definitely, Patrushev's son most likely, who's probably going to follow Putin after Putin dies. But if you go through this list of people who's very close, Bortnikov, I think what you would see in common is that they probably share a worldview that the West is destined to collapse. It's a matter of time. And when it collapses due to the fact that the proletarian's been suppressed, the common people, whoever that is, whether it's minorities or it's the environment, or by being oppressed, they will finally have this lid blown off, and they will overthrow their government or create enough civil war within the country that it's not a threat to Russia. But in no case is the objective here to work more with the West. The objective here is to break the West.
What are your suggestions now to the governments or to whomever, to the media? What are your suggestions to change this bad situation and to keep democracies alive?
Well, it is something that's worth like an entire study, and I'm sure I know many people are studying this, because Russia. Listen, I gotta say, is like, I mean, you know me well. I typically live in Kyiv, not Washington. I'm here at the moment, but I'm typically in Kyiv, and I've been there for more than a decade. I spent almost 20 years now living in the former Soviet states. And my master's and PhD relates specifically to the Putin regime and how it operates. So it's something I've thought, trust me, a lot about. It's not something I say flippantly. But what the device would be is that it's extremely complicated. Because no matter what we want to do, is not going to be a one-fit solution. I mean, Russia arrests people who are in the opposition. It arrests you if you search for things on your cell phone or on the internet. It is actively making sure that there is no civil society. In the West, we encourage civil society. You can't spy on your own citizens, and you should not spy on your own citizens. I'm not encouraging this. I'm not encouraging a police state. I'm saying Russia looks at what we consider to be freedom and says, how can we use that in our advantage? So it's to use the Russian Orthodox Church. Nobody wants to attack religion. Nobody wants to attack the Muslim immigrants that come from Russia either. Why? Well, they're Muslim minorities, so this also makes it sensitive. But they realize that works to their benefit in Europe, which would be sensitive to arrest them because it looks bad. They understand that when they use things such as private individuals. Russia is famous for the fact that the Kremlin, the vast majority of what it does, including the propaganda, is usually not paid for by the Kremlin. It's paid for by the oligarchs who are forced to do it by the Kremlin. So if you have a private individual, a man who is from Russia, who has billions of dollars, who in his private interest decides he would like to make contributions to universities, which they do often in London, guess what? He has huge influence there. And so then when he comes around, he starts promoting different things, saying we should really research this or look into that. Everybody says yes, because he has prestige and he's given millions and millions, but it's a Kremlin making donation via him. But how do you say that in civil society? Because we're used to a society where, to take away his right to do this would look like it's discrimination or something else. But the fact is, we have to understand, he became a billionaire because he worked the Putin regime. It wasn't a miracle. He didn't start a local ice cream store and sold a lot of ice cream. He took over state industries from the Soviet Union and then was able to capitalize on that, and the Putin regime helped him to spread. So in Europe today, when we look at things that are being built actively by the Russians, whether it's buildings, whether it's contributions to universities, whether it's contributions to sciences, by the way, music as well, to the culture, the arts, what is that? It's because then they are respectable in the society and makes it acceptable what they would do next. Look at the purchasing of news organizations by Russian-linked people in the past few years. But how do you actively say that's impossible without saying it's discrimination? I mean, this is where it gets very complicated. And in the case of Russia, where it gets even more complicated is if you're dealing with a state agent. Let's imagine tomorrow some government, Germany. Actually, I'll use a real one. Let's look at the case of the Scandinavian states who have noticed an upsurge of, if I recall correctly, it was China as well as Russia buying up tons of land near their Air Force bases. Now, is that by coincidence? I assume it's not. Now, at the same time, you'd say, but if they're smart about it, the way you would do is send a private individual. Send somebody who's registered his company as being in Paris. It has an address that really nobody knows, but it's linked to someone. You can, do enough backwork so if it's Googled, it looks like it's just a normal, some Parisians own it. You pay a couple guys to be on the board. They each get paid a small salary. It's a law firm typically does this sort of a service. Okay, pay a couple $1,000s. Law firm registers it. It's a law firm who's buying it. They say, represent a trust. Well, that could just be tons of money come from an oligarch that received essentially an order from the Kremlin, and the Kremlin didn't tell them to do this. What they typically say is, it'd be very helpful if somebody were to do this. And if you're not dumb, you understand very well what Putin wants from you, and you go achieve that. So I think it's exactly the same here.
I mean, that is again some pessimistic view. I try to get some optimistic view out of you now, but it's not so easy.
Well, where I'm optimistic, you should have started with that. Then I could have told you why I'm also not so worried, to be frank, is because, yes, there are immediate problems that are very concerning and they're not being addressed. I am not happy about that. At the same time, I recognize that there's a lot of different things happening at the same time, one of which is that Russia itself is having significant problems.
Mm-hmm.
The Russian economy is not sustainable. The Russian military is not in a sustainable position. We see that they have 2.2% unemployment rate, which is actually not a sign of good economy. That's sort of a low unemployment rate. It should be closer to, let's say, roughly 6% in Russia, given its size and everything else. About 6%, but it's 2.2. That means that there's very high inflation, which is why about 50% of Russians today are saying that they're looking for a second job. And just think about that. How many of your friends do you know actively look for a second job? Can you imagine 50% of Russians say they're in that category? That's a lot of people. That means that their currency is losing value. We see that the real inflation rate, according to someone like Professor Henke at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., is probably closer to about 26%. Now, the central bank, of course, says it's about 10%, and the key interest rate is about 20%. But still, there's a lot of serious economic problems. We know that the toxic debt that their banks have accepted is something that's going to eventually explode. We see what's happening in the Moscow Birja, the Moscow Stock Market Exchange, and the St. Petersburg Stock Market Exchange. We see that their budget nationally is about, I think it's $72 per barrel is what they need to balance their budget. But currently they're selling their oil for about $55 per barrel. Their economy has got significant problems. We don't know all the details, but we see many of them that lead us to believe that Russia is eventually going to collapse. And it's not just nuts. That's not crazy. Just look at the data. There's nothing positive coming out.
Yeah.
So that's a positive. And look at one other thing I'll say just really quick, because I love the statistic, is that, think about it this way. The two things is that, one, since 2022, Russia has arrested, the FSB, the Security Service of Russia, has arrested about 16 generals from the Russian military. By comparison, since 2020, even 2 years before that, there's been 0 generals in the U.S. military who have been arrested. Why is that? Because the U.S. is a normal country and our generals don't get arrested. In Russia, it's very common, and that's because the FSB is now waging war against the military. And that's a very good thing for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The more that they're focused on their own problems, trying to prevent their own arrest, I mean, they're all engaged in corruption, all these generals. So they're trying to figure out how to cover that up. How do they prevent themselves from going to jail? The more they're convinced that they're about to go to jail, and they spend their time and their money on that, trying to prevent that from happening, the less time and money they're spending on the war. The more they're using the resources to cover up their corruption. And these things are all good for Ukraine. Ultimately, Russia can't continue to fight this war forever. And the most important feature here, which is very complicated, but in short, is the fact that Vladimir Putin's calculation in this, we have to understand. What are his objectives? Now, taking Ukraine is very important. I think it's a very high importance for him. However, much more important for him than this, by far, is his survivor. If he can survive, it's the only thing he really cares about, like any dictator. So dictators make mistakes and they lose their regimes all the time. But in his case, I think that he is watching carefully this, and he understands that if he plays his cards wrongly, he could very well topple. His regime could fall. And as a result, he must operate with what is his best interest. So he's fighting between the FSB and the military. I think right now he probably views it as his best interest. But it also opens the military up to revolt and other things. Again, given the situation of the banking sector, the very day that the ruble starts to hyperinflate, for instance, the military, I think, very well could collapse. I mean, there's just no way to pay. They have huge shortages already. But when you just stop feeding the soldiers, or you feed them, with money that has no value, I think the Russian military truthfully could collapse.
Mm-hmm. So those are really optimistic views, and the question is only, as you mentioned, you said infinitely. No, it cannot continue like that infinitely. The time is the key question. So Putin is playing on the time. Will the West collapse before him? That's the question, because he's destroying us with all his means. And can we keep our democracy going before? Would he collapse or we? And I'm not sure about that. So we have to keep our democracies running, and that's from election to election. We are saying, this time the AfD has got not so much, thanks God, and Marine Le Pen is still not president. But for the next elections, it can be really tough. We have maybe a time window.
It's gonna be,
yeah, 2 years.
I agree with you. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you. I agree with you totally.
Yeah. So how can we keep this run, or how can we make Russia collapse before this? That's, I mean, the only ones who can make this are the Ukrainians, because we can make it too, but we don't. We don't seize the money, the Russian assets. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, you're absolutely no. I'm just saying I agree with you. That's all. I think you're totally right. No, and good examples of those assets. Let's look at that. So I think even before the assets, let's start with the premise. To find a solution to a problem, you have to recognize that you have a problem and to identify it. But today, I don't hear many people in the West identifying this as a significant problem. I mean, you do, of course. You're very well aware of what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. And a lot of other voices who are sort of in our bubble, people that are interested in what's going on in global politics or with Eurasia, but most people aren't. So unfortunately, they don't realize there's a problem to be addressed. And that includes policymakers. Exactly. That includes the political leaders. And they're also scared to be serious about this, to really wrestle with the fact that, yes, we have segments of the population are serving a foreign government's interest. How do we deal with this correctly? And, how do you identify this without infringing on free speech? Because I'm also very much in favor of free speech. I don't like the government to, be inflicting. I don't want us to end up like Russia. But at the same time, I don't want us to end up like Russia because we're part of it, because we didn't listen to these signs. So what is the balance between these things? And this is all becomes philosophical at some point. But I think today, realistically, there are good signs about this. And it's interesting enough, my theory about what's the best things we could do right now in the very limited form are things that cost us almost no money. And I give you an example. When we look at social medias, which are by far the most influential form of media today, much more than television or anything else, what do we see? Well, we see that Russia definitely tries to manipulate algorithms and to manipulate public information, things like this. But over time, especially since the war in Ukraine began, companies like Meta have become much, much, much better at trying to detect in the algorithms what is not organic. That is, it's being produced by perhaps a foreign country. And when that is identified by something like Stratcom, which is the Office of Strategic Communications and Information Security in Ukraine, they send a note to Meta, and Meta then strikes it, pulls it offline. That's a huge positive. That, by the way, that is a huge shift. Because imagine if you're a private citizen sharing something, which you agree with, but it turns out to be from Russia. Well, where's the difference between it's okay because it is your private view versus you can say that, but not using this exact material because we know that the source was not local. It was not, produced here. We know it's a foreign source or some sort of justification. How do you separate them? But the fact that Meta is already working on this is a good sign because the amount of money they have is simply incredible. It's more than most European countries. I mean, how much money does Meta and Google have combined, which owns YouTube? We're talking just massive beyond most countries in this world. So the fact that they have their best scientists, which are the best scientists in the world, undoubtedly, I have no doubt they really are. Some of the best are working there just because they have the resources to hire the very best. And that actually gives me more hope than a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., who really doesn't understand these topics, that doesn't understand what algorithm is. How can they write a law or a policy about this? They can't. So how can we encourage this or force Google and these other companies to do what is right? I think this is the trick. And it is not to use our policymakers to try to create laws because it won't work. They don't have the technical knowledge to understand this. They don't understand long-term what this means, what these trends mean. The level of knowledge is so much greater than what they have. It's not possible. But the way you can do it successfully is that you have them put pressure on the private companies. That if the private companies are not able to clamp down on Russian influence or Chinese, whatever it is, then in which case there will be more regulation. The last thing they want is to be regulated by some bureaucrat who has no understanding of how their field works, who will totally destroy their business. That's bad for the shareholders. So it's much better for their shareholders to be able to control this threat, this potential for federalization or national investigations, to make sure that doesn't happen by doing the hard work themselves to prevent Russia from being able to manipulate the populations in European or Western countries.
Okay. I don't know how to finish this one now because this is so interesting talking to you, and it's so much knowledge you've got. But yeah,
I wish I'd slept more than 2 hours last night because when I'm awake, I think my answer is much shorter. So I'm sorry for that.
Are you a little bit tired or what? Yeah, me too.
I think I've slept over this weekend maybe 8 hours in total since Thursday.
Yeah, we had also a lot of things to do this. But as I said, we only have, I guess, two more years, and then the situation can be really much worse, or it can be resolved when the Russian regime is.
Well, but I don't think it's going to change. I mean, I think that fundamentally, I mean, the Democrats, the Russians also, they support movements in the Democratic Party too. It's not just on one side. They really do fundamentally believe that, which is, I think, the most important thing is Russia's worldview or the Russian worldview, I should say, that's held by the Kremlin today, is one that eventually the Western countries will collapse. The left and the right are equally enemies. Nobody's preferred. Yes, in a given campaign, I guess they probably do have one they like more than the other, but ultimately they realize that they're all chess pieces. They don't think of them as equals. So when you have a favorite country or a favorite ally, that means that you're not treating them all the same. You're not treating them all as enemies, but they treat them all as enemies. They don't view any of them to be their allies. They view one to be a more useful idiot at this moment, perhaps. But in the Democratic Party, for instance, we talk about Donald Trump. Okay, fine, probably true. And we know that they've been involved with the National Rifle Association and other things, right? We know that's the case. We know they're involved with Christian conservatism. These are all like provable facts. We know that they're involved with, ties to Hungary, which the Republican Party has today as well. But on the left, they also do as well. I'd have to imagine things that are just generally unpopular in the population, whether it's woke culture, or sort of sexual minority rights, when we're dealing with minorities that are less than 0.001% of the population but dominate 80% of the news cycle is about this. Who has something to gain from this? Like, really, who's pushing this as being the Democratic Party, or making it perceived that this is central to what the Democratic Party wants? Because when you do that, the Democratic Party looks also crazy. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't look good, but it doesn't make them look smarter. It doesn't make them look wiser to the average person who doesn't want to hear about these sorts of things. They want to understand how voting for this candidate will make their life better. How will my quality of life improve? I'll have a better salary. I mean, how will my life improve? And when they're hearing about something that's an extreme minority right, 0.01% of the population, they said, that has nothing to do with me. You're so divorced from the reality of my life and my problems that that's your priority. I can't support you. And that's how Trump wins elections. But also, unfortunately, I think that is how the Democratic Party is also being manipulated. It's not one side or the other. Both are manipulated by Russia. And the people who are involved in the party, I don't think are bad. I don't think that they're intentionally trying to do what it serves Russia. Usually. I think the vast majority of the time, they're doing what they think is in their own interest, or what they think their base wants to hear. But it could very well be algorithms of Moscow helping to make sure more people see those proclamations than they otherwise would, because it realizes it will create more tension in American society, split the population more and more, and create more conflict.
Yeah. So the only thing we really need is a strong leader, a strong leader, which sounds like a dictator, but we need a good, strong leader, or someone like Churchill, a guy who has really got the right compass and knows where to go, where to lead the people, how to unite. Otherwise, I don't know how this can be resolved out of nothing, out of the chaos. I cannot see without leadership, we cannot solve this problem. So where to get it from? This is the question we cannot answer tonight or today. And, yeah. So Jason, thank you very much for this very interesting interview. And thanks so much that you had time for me today. And hopefully we can meet again another day.
Yeah, sure.
Wish you all
very nice talking with you, Christoph. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.